Hey everybody, it's Steve here, and I'm back on my rambles on the broad topics of passenger rail in the United States. And oh boy, has the transit and railverse been a buzz lately. And it's of course everyone's favorite rail topic for aficionados, activists, and the dubiously informed layperson and politician to banter about in the US. High-speed rail. The topic and the debate that is almost always attached to it about high-speed rail in the US is one that's been hot on the mind of a lot of those who love transportation ever since the first high-speed rail line, Japan's famous Tokaido Shinkansen between Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka, opened in 1964. And amazingly, the US was remarkably quick to follow up on this new concept of rail travel, though the response would turn out to hold much less water in practice, though not for a lack of the concept being sound. In fact, before the 1960s, the US was the gold standard of high-speed rail travel, with famous streamlined trains like the Burlington Route's Zephyrs and Flyers, the Southern Pacific's Daylights, the Hiawatha's of
the Milwaukee Road,
and the rivalry between the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central, epitomized by the rivalry of the Central's 20th Century Limited and the Penzie's Broadway Limited on the run between New York and Chicago, and the Penzie's forward-thinking electric services between New York and Washington, epitomized by their flagship Congressional Limited, laid the groundwork for what could have potentially been a high-speed rail network that could have been carried on long into the future and to the present day. Why that didn't materialize is a long and arduous topic that I will definitely talk about in the future. But with the introduction of the metro liners on the Northeast Corridor in the late 1960s, the US did at least try to make a step towards high-speed rail networks at the same time as the Japanese, and before the French, Italians, and Germans took a crack at the topic. For numerous reasons, namely the unreliability of the Metroliner trains in service, largely due to the project being extremely rushed, a lack of government and private investment beyond the initial Metroliner project, largely because of this, the collapse of the private railroads who ran passenger trains in this country, thus leading them to pawn off passenger services to the government to create Amtrak, and of course, an overzealous use of the money that could have gone to it going towards freeways, many of which are now regretted, particularly in cities. High-speed rail in America has been left to be a dream for many for nearly 60 years at this point. However, it would seem that in the year 2024, that dream may be closer to reality than it has ever been. And in this ramble of mine, I'll be going over why that is, all the various high-speed rail projects either underway, on the drawing board, or even actually running. Yes, you heard me right, we actually have a high-speed rail service running in the US. And it might not be the one you're thinking of if you've been reading a lot of hype news. I'll explain more in depth when we get to it, but first I must lay out some basic ground rules. What actually is high-speed rail? It seems like the definitions of what constitute high-speed rail varies from country to country or even commentator to commentator. But contrary to what some may think, what constitutes high-speed rail or not is not predicated on what the trains on the service can do, but what the tracks they run on are capable of handling. While different governments have varying definitions, with the US considering anything above 110 miles an hour high-speed rail, and Britain considering anything above 125 miles per hour high-speed rail, I'll be looking to a more scholarly source on the matter. In this case, I'll be turning to the UIC, the Union Internationale de Chemin de Fer, or International Union of Railways, who break it down into three categories. Category 1 is the kind where the line is purpose-built for high-speed trains, and the minimum speed to meet this requirement is 250 kilometers per hour, or 155 miles per hour line speed. Category 2 is where existing rail lines are upgraded to attain higher speeds, with the threshold being a line speed of 200 kilometers an hour, or 124 miles per hour. Category 3 is essentially similar to Category 2 in terms of its minimum top speed threshold, but is more lenient towards slower speeds for dealing with geography or urban areas, and frankly I'm not sure why that distinction exists. Regardless, the first two definitions in particular are of interest, since it leads to two different kinds of high-speed rail being considered legitimate, one of which we have running in the States as of the date of making this video. But easily the more exciting version, and many would argue the most legitimate definition of high-speed rail, would be the Category 1 definition, with lines designed to accommodate high-speed operations from day one, such as the likes of the Shinkansen lines of Japan, the LGV lines of France designed for their famous TGV trains, the AVE lines of Spain, the Direttissima lines of Italy, the purpose-built ICE lines in Germany, and the bowl of wet spaghetti that is China's utterly massive network. However, I will also consider the lines that fall under Category 2 as legitimate as well, since not only do high-speed trains run on them elsewhere, but there are upgraded legacy lines, such as a few lines in Germany, that have been brought up to the same speeds as traditional Category 1 lines despite their legacy routes. This will be important for later. And before I get to the projects in question, it's time to get to the big question that so many people, particularly those unfamiliar with trains in general but are curious as to the idea of them, seem to hem and haw over. Can high-speed rail work in the US? The answer to this is actually pretty simple. Yes, it can. Quite easily, in fact. In fact, it's pretty evident after a bit of thought over the evidence laid on the table that the people who claim that the US is quote-unquote too big for high-speed rail are mostly not great with geography, and more than anything else, they're merely looking in the wrong place. And frankly, proposed network maps like these springing up on the internet don't really help that perception. What I mean by that is that there are people out there that think high-speed rail advocates are talking about building them to compete with planes on cross-country and transcontinental runs, or as revivals of old long-distance streamliners, like New York to Los Angeles, for example. In reality though, when you spend time with people who are actually serious about this sort of system and looking at the current services proposed, under construction, or operating, you'll realize that high-speed rail is actually meant to compete with both planes and cars on a much less talked about but infinitely more important travel market. That is, getting between regional centers and trans-regional bridging services. I'll put it to you like this. Not many people are in the position that they fly across the country on a regular basis, but a lot more people weigh the option of either flying or driving between various places across a region. This is exactly the sort of distance and routes that high-speed rail can be the dominant player in, and both reduce traffic on roads and hurt or outright destroy an air corridor's market share. Even before the moves to slowly legislate such flights out of existence in Europe, high-speed rail was already proving to be a killer for domestic air services. Alitalia, Italy's national airline, went bankrupt a few years ago, in part because of high-speed trains sucking away their market share on domestic operations. But for me, the most spectacular example of this happening was in France, where the country's main domestic air carrier, Air Inter, entered an unrecoverable death spiral after the first TGV lines opened in the 1980s and 90s. So why did this happen? Several reasons. The trains were far more comfortable, they were more convenient for more people, and most importantly of all, they were faster than flying in the main place where speed actually matters, which is going from an actual city to another actual city, not just airport to airport. And bear in mind, this was a time before the airport security theater we know today. As a result, Air Inter was absorbed into Air France in 1990 and dissolved outright in 1997. And to this day, Air France does not run domestic services that directly compete against the TGV lines because they know it's a losing proposition. The only way such operations have historically been able to compete against high-speed trains is with budget airlines trying to undercut them on fares. But there's a problem with that too. The high-speed train operators like SNCF and Renfe are now running their own budget high-speed rail services like Ouigo and Avlo. And when one considers that a lot of regions and states in the US, like the Northeast, the Southeast, California, Texas, Florida, the Pacific Northwest, and the Midwest, are comparable in both size and population to countries in Europe, with many cities within 500 miles of each other, well within the area between 150 and 500 miles where high-speed rail tends to be the fastest means of transport between two cities, then it becomes clear that a high-speed rail network for the US can definitely work. Naturally, this also comes down to an argument of cost, something I will certainly get into, don't you worry. But there are some interesting developments regarding high-speed rail that, if proven successful with a certain project on the docket, could see high-speed rail built for far cheaper than the current price points that everybody is understandably scared of. Now then, let's move along swiftly to the projects aiming to bring high-speed rail to the US, or at least in more parts than where it technically already exists. And let's start off with the darling of the day for the topic, and the latest project to begin construction, Brightline West. On April 22, 2024, Brightline West, a long proposed and now under construction high-speed rail line running between Las Vegas, Nevada and Rancho Cucamonga in Southern California's Inland Empire region west of LA, officially broke ground. Why the line isn't going to LA proper is a long story, but I'll explain that in relation to two other projects they intertwine with, both metaphorically and in the future literally. But in any case, the idea behind Brightline West actually goes all the way back to 2005, long before Brightline the company was even a thought. When the project first started its development, it was known as Desert Express, but even then, one of the core principles of the project was there from the beginning. And that was the plan to build the majority of the line, if not all of it, in the median of Interstate 15, thus saving on cost. Originally, another way Desert Express would have saved money was its end terminus station. Rather than the sprawling Inland Empire city of Rancho Cucamonga, which is not exactly a dense area, but certainly one where a fair amount of people live both in and around, Desert Express would have terminated in Victorville, which, yes, has a population comparable to Rancho Cucamonga, but has nothing but desert around it, whereas Rancho has a lot of Inland Empire sprawl around it that at least has people. This was because for the venture, building the line over the infamous Cajon Pass would have been far too expensive for them, and this alongside its top speed of 150 miles an hour, which would just barely mean it wouldn't qualify as Category 1 high-speed rail, which is particularly annoying on a dedicated line. Perhaps annoyingly for them, this all meant that the project sat in neutral for years, even after rebranding as Express West in 2012. But again, it ran into a lot of tire spinning for a while, particularly with state and federal officials, who, while designating the route a federal high-speed rail corridor, hemmed and hawed about whether to fully back it or not. This wasn't at all helped in 2015 when Express West announced a partnership with a consortium of Chinese companies to provide technical assistance for the project. Naturally, this gave it a negative stigma and it went quiet in 2016. In 2018, though, Fortress Investments, the investment group who created Brightline in Florida, which I'll touch on later, bought the rights to the project, and over the last 6 years has methodically improved upon the plan and gotten things in order for it to be built, and even going over the Cajon Pass to the planned new terminus at Rancho Cucamonga, and a top speed that was increased to either 190 or 200 miles per hour in sections of the route across the desert, largely depending on who's saying it. Brightline saying it's 200 now, which I hope is true. Sure, it's not all the way to LA, but the location chosen for the end terminus is the site of the commuter rail station in Rancho, where passengers can transfer between Brightline high-speed trains and Metrolink commuter trains on the San Bernardino line, though statements from Brightline staff suggest that they would like to see the electrification of the San Bernardino line from Rancho to LA's Union Station so that Brightline West could run a direct service to downtown LA. Whether this is them just wish casting or suggesting that Brightline West could help fund said electrification and likely double tracking of the line isn't really known to me, but it'd be really cool if it did to expand its potential ridership, alongside developments planned along the two intermediate stations in Hesperia and Victor Valley, which as of now sit in the middle of nowhere, but Brightline already has plans to create new developments around the stations. And this in turn leads me to a major thing to consider with this project that doesn't get the attention it deserves. Brightline is not and was never created as a railroad company. It was created by Fortress Investments as a real estate development plan, with the train service serving as a catalyst for transit-oriented development, in a way that actually takes a lot of pages out of the books of railroads of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, creating stations from which whole towns and cities would develop around them. This is a tried and tested way for a rail business to make money off of real estate and train services, and honestly, I don't have too much against it, particularly since the development with high-speed rail service in mind can be a net good for emissions and sustainability of the venture. But in any case, it's also good to talk about the service itself and how much it will cost to build. As mentioned, the line runs from Las Vegas to Rancho Cucamonga, a length of 218 miles with a purported travel time of 2 hours and 10 minutes at an average speed of 101 miles per hour from start to finish and a top speed of 200 miles per hour on the long straight runs across the Mojave Desert, with the big discrepancy largely coming from the expected low speeds when the line's going through the Cajon Pass itself on rather steep gradients that, while hard to handle for most trains, Brightline's trains are expected to power over them, which is actually not unheard of either, since it's done regularly by high-speed trains in Europe, especially in France. As for those trains, it was also recently announced the manufacturer for the new trains for Brightline West will be, to the shock of nobody who's familiar with Brightline, Siemens Mobility. And the reason I say it's to the shock of nobody is because Siemens and Brightline have a long-standing relationship, with Siemens making the trains that Brightline currently uses on its already running service in Florida between Miami and Orlando. Of course, since the trains they currently use are only capable of 125 miles per hour in regular service on the purpose-built section of the line between Orlando and Cocoa, Florida, and between 80 and 110 miles an hour on the legacy lines they use everywhere else and thus don't really qualify as high-speed trains anyway, these trains will be something quite different. Quite different indeed. The train type selected for the service is the brand new Siemens Velaro Novo, an evolution of the highly successful Siemens Velaro family of high-speed trains, perhaps most famously known as the ICE trains in Germany, while also being successful in Spain and China among several other places. In particular, the variant of the Velaro Novo being built for Brightline is a version specifically geared for the American market, called, because of course it's called something like this, the American Pioneer 220, with the 220 marking its 220 miles per hour top service speed, which alludes that not only is Siemens gearing these trains for Brightline West, but also for another project which is being built to run at a top speed of 220 miles an hour right now. Before I get into that project, the Velaro Novos for Brightline don't have much concrete about them that's publicly available, aside from the fact that Brightline West intends to have one car on each train known as the Party Car, which from the render suggested to be a very nice buffet lounge car, alongside the comfortable seating in the coaches that Brightline is known for back in Florida. On the flip side though, some off-color comments from Brightline West president suggest that ticket prices could easily be in the $400 range on day one, which definitely received a lot of backlash. Do I believe they'll be that price? Well, considering what Brightline is trying to do in Florida, making it expensive to travel between West Palm Beach and Miami so they can free up space on their absurdly short 4-car trains on the run to Orlando, it's not the most insane thing I can see from them, but I don't see it sticking around for too long or even continuing into Brightline West, largely due to the fact that on the Florida run, they'll be getting more equipment to lengthen trains to 8 cars, and I expect the Velaro Novos can be at least 7 cars from day one, though we don't know for certain how long cars on the Velaros will be. Again, more will be revealed as time goes on, but one thing is for sure. The cost that they estimate that they can complete this project is $12 billion, or around $55 million per mile, which compared to high-speed intercity rail projects elsewhere, like France, where the average cost is $40 million per mile, and Spain, where it's $22 million per mile, it does mean that it's not the cheapest HSR project ever made, but it can be a step in the right direction even if they go over budget. And this is definitely a project to keep an eye on for potential future developments in high-speed rail in North America and how the concept can move into new markets much easier than it currently is. And it's definitely hoped it can do so, considering the other dedicated high-speed rail project currently under construction as of 2024 is one of those things that is guaranteed to start a fight whenever it's said. California High-Speed Rail. Here we go. I said the magic words. California high-speed rail is the furthest along and easily the most contentious of any high-speed rail project and maybe any transit project in the US alongside the 2nd Avenue subway in New York. Given that opinion pieces on the project, a lot of them not very well made or thought out frankly, are about as common as a traffic jam on the 405, a lot of the context is lost it seems. California High-Speed Rail, as its name implies, is a high-speed rail project meant to link the major cities of the state with purpose-built high-speed lines capable of enabling trains to operate at 220 miles per hour. Approved by California voters by Proposition 1A in 2008, meaning that the project was greenlit by not merely a law, but the state's equivalent of a constitutional amendment, the project called for a primary high-speed trunk line to run between the two most obvious places to build such a line, the San Francisco Bay Area in the north and the Los Angeles Basin to the south, running through the state's Central Valley along the way, with 2 branch lines, if you want to call them that, going from LA to San Diego and Merced in the Central Valley to the state capital of Sacramento, earmarked for the future after the LA to San Fran line is complete. Groundbreaking for the project took place in 2015, but pretty quickly things got rough for it. Due to California's rampant NIMBYism, along with receiving only sporadic spurts of funding from the state, not helped by Caltrans, the State Department of Transportation being staffed with some of the most egregiously car-brained higher-ups of any DOT in the country, so much so that they were caught undertaking illegal highway widening projects. You heard me right, illegal highway widening projects, and the lack of federal backing until relatively recently, made far worse by weak contracts between the agency and the contractors building the initial parts of the line that began construction in the Central Valley, land acquisition woes and change orders, the project was quickly finding itself both delayed by a decade, not joking, and with its initial $35 billion cost rising to the current $120 billion, just for the San Fran to LA segment, which has led to the project predicting its first day of service to be in 2030 at earliest, and only between Bakersfield and Merced, while the rest of the lines are built out. Needless to say, it's been a very rough going for this project, but the last little while has seen a bit of renewed hope in some ways for this project. As I discussed back in January, in December 2023, the project got a $3.1 billion federal grant that is further speeding up the construction in some areas and planning and design in others, along with paying for the first 6 trains that would run the service. And this is also being inspired by the fact that one of the 4 construction packages, namely the southernmost section, CP4, is just about complete and will see track laying next year. You heard me right, we have a section of California high-speed rail right-of-way pretty much complete. Annoyingly, the other sections of the line are slowly chugging along and not predicted to be completed soon. The fortunate thing though is that the timeline hasn't been delayed any further for now at the very least, and despite what some journalists who would have people who only read the title of articles believe, the projected budget did not jump $100 billion, as that's how much more needs to be spent to get it going within budget, ridiculous contingency costs forced upon them and all, with the current expenditure sitting around $11 billion as of this writing. And yes, that's where that lie in the New York Post recently came about an $11 billion bridge to nowhere. They were pretty quickly exposed and the article was deleted, but it does show that the project does have a lot of bad press surrounding it. And while a good chunk of it is sensationalism, it's not like the project is innocent here with its horrendous management, particularly management of contracts in its early years and still now to some extent. However, after the project was forced to undertake a reshuffle of management in 2019, it seems like the project, under the direction of Chairman Brian Kelly, seems to be moving in a better direction, particularly with how it manages contractors for the extensions into Bakersfield and Merced proper, and for the future extensions from there to San Jose, Palmdale, and the LA Basin. Regardless, a lot of impetus has to be put on the governments, state and federal, for this project, as it's both an imperative for future-proofing the state's economy, getting California anywhere near its lofty environmental goals, and be another project like Brightline West and 2 other projects on the docket that shows Americans what trains are capable of, why they're a benefit to all, and can get people across the country and their states to say, why can't that be us? There are a lot of obstacles to overcome for California high-speed rail, but none of them are technical in nature. All of them are political. And given that Caltrans is coming under heavy fire for its own scumbaggery and their illegal highway widening projects, after a whistleblower outed them, got demoted, and is now on the warpath on the matter, it seems that one of the most car-centric states in the Union may finally be getting the memo that things cannot continue as they are for any longer if the state wants to continue to be the economic powerhouse it currently is. While $120 billion for Phase 1, or an outlandish $243 million per mile for the 494-mile route from LA to San Fran may be a hard pill to swallow, it's ultimately a medicine that the state needs to take, because highway widening is even more expensive overall and an outright net negative for the people who live there, who already have to deal with the infamous traffic of almost every California city, no matter what Caltrans has tried on the road side of things, which in turn has become the transport equivalent of banging your head against a wall hoping to knock it down. Considering that Los Angeles is building out the largest light rail system on the continent right now, and with the passing of Measure HLA this past March, which is a comprehensive legislation to redevelop the road network into something for more than just cars with better sidewalk and cycling infrastructure citywide, along with San Francisco already having a pretty encompassing transit system, albeit one that is spread across 21 different transit agencies. I'm not joking. And the fact that their housing policy is being rightly taken out of their control due to their flagrant failure at meeting affordable housing legislation set by the state, it seems that things could be on the cusp of a turnaround for the Golden State overall. But more on the actual project itself and what it's aimed to be like when it finally does start up. While I said that the first section of the high-speed rail line is about to be complete, in actuality, another section of the line has existed for well over a century and is seeing a major upgrade as part of its use in the high-speed rail project. And that's the Caltrain line between San Francisco and San Jose, which, with the help of the California High-Speed Rail Authority, has just been upgraded and electrified, with Caltrain bringing in some brand new and really cool Stadler Kiss double-decker EMU sets to run their services, replacing the current F40PHs and gallery cars. That service is set to begin in November. And on top of that, there's a tunnel project that also just got federal backing in San Francisco to connect Caltrain and the high-speed rail trains to the route's northern terminus, the recently rebuilt Transbay Terminal. In fact, the Transbay Terminal already has a train box underneath it specifically for high-speed rail and Caltrain ready to go, but there's currently no tunnel connecting it. However, that's likely to change by the time HSR finally gets online, with the tunnel between the terminal and the current Caltrain station at 4th and King receiving the funding to start construction soon. Running at 110 miles an hour down the Caltrain line to San Jose, the line then continues southeast to Gilroy, before breaking off to the east on the 220-mile-per-hour right-of-way through the mountains to reach the initial operating segment at a Y just south of Merced, before continuing through Madeira, Fresno, Kings Tulare, which is basically a park and ride with a future connection to a proposed east-west rail corridor for the region, and then to Bakersfield, its initial end terminus. After Bakersfield, it then weaves through the mountains to Palmdale to possibly connect with Brightline West, which I'll talk about later, before finally making it to the LA Basin, with 3 stops planned at Burbank Airport, LA's Union Station, which itself is getting a big, albeit scaled back and also delayed upgrade, and finally to Anaheim, where the initial trunk line ends. As for the 2 other branches, when they finally get started, by the time we're old and gray, the northern branch runs beyond the current extent of the line at Merced up through Modesto and Stockton to the state's capital of Sacramento, while the southern branch from LA to San Diego would begin from LA's Union Station, run out to the Inland Empire to Ontario, likely serving the airport, before turning south and running through the hills inland to Murrieta and Escondido before reaching San Diego. Some people have also discussed possible extensions to Tijuana, Mexico, and maybe Phoenix, Arizona, likely in the same way as Brightline West, or maybe run by Brightline, by running that line in the median of Interstate 10 for much of the way. But nothing serious has been discussed about that either, even though LA to Phoenix would be another one of those perfect links too. Speaking of Brightline, there is another way that Brightline and California High-Speed Rail could connect in the future and interoperate with each other, and that is the much more seriously considered High Desert Corridor, which is a planned freeway extension in the middle of the desert, which is also planned with a high-speed rail right-of-way in mind, which would run from Victorville to Palmdale and thus be a bridge connecting the California High-Speed Rail right-of-way with the Brightline West right-of-way. This one is actually being planned, thankfully, due to the creation of a joint powers board specific to the project, because California has a fetish for those it seems, and also that Brightline West and California High-Speed Rail may be running the same equipment as each other for their services, thus allowing for direct rail service between the Bay Area and Las Vegas, and the running of Brightline trains over California High-Speed Rail's lines and vice versa. In more than just this way, it seems that California High-Speed Rail and Brightline West are not really adversarial in a lot of ways and want to work together in certain areas, including a possible use of the same trains on their services. California High-Speed Rail is already weighing between different manufacturers for their trains, and from an initial 3, Siemens, Hyundai Rotem, and Alstom, Hyundai Rotem dropped out of the competition recently, sadly, and it's now between the aforementioned Siemens Velaro Novo and a custom version of the Alstom Avelia Liberty, a train that I'll be going into a lot more agonizing detail later. As I mentioned in a previous video about the Corridor ID grants, I see Siemens as the obvious choice here, not only because of the Avelia Liberty's long-running issues with Amtrak, but also due to the Velaro family's proven track record, Brightline's recent order of them, and the fact that they're built locally, as Siemens' North American Rail Vehicle Assembly Plant is located in Florin, California, outside of Sacramento. And with their second factory under construction in North Carolina taking pressure off the Florin factory, particularly for Amtrak's bulk order of their Aero train sets, Siemens will have the know-how, the capacity, and the political palatability for this order. And the fact that the Velaro Novos are damn good-looking trains only adds to this point. Nothing is confirmed on this front yet, but it will likely be so in the near future. Definitely watch this space. On the whole, California High-Speed Rail has not become the best way for true Category 1 high-speed rail to make its American debut, but it is one that's not only necessary for the state, but when it's complete, could easily be the grandest project of them all. The fact that California aspires to this sort of network is admirable, and while their execution may have many faults that need to be fixed, it seems likely to me to have the biggest shift in take once the trains get running, in a way similar to the likes of the first TGV line, and perhaps more directly, the first Italian high-speed rail line between Rome and Florence, which frankly has a similar story to California High-Speed Rail, in which a 200-mile rail line took 22 years to complete, but now it's one of the most vital links in the whole country. Definitely a topic I'll delve more into later, but I know a great video on the matter that I'll link here. In any case, definitely watch this space with CAHSR, and definitely check out the YouTube channels of Lucid Stew and Ampere Beep for updates on the project directly, and I recommend checking out both of them since they seem to approach the project from different perspectives. For all of its faults, California High-Speed Rail has some of the greatest potential in the world for any transportation project, and it needs to be pursued more aggressively. It's a hard pill to swallow, but that pill is the transport equivalent of a chemotherapy medication to fight cancer. Keep strong, California. Brightline may be running before you do, but if anything, that could be a good thing for support for the project once people see what high-speed rail can do. And moving along to the last of the big hype train projects with dedicated rights of way that's always in the conversation, albeit often brought up just in passing for the most part, and it's easily the one that gives California High-Speed Rail a run for its money in terms of sheer agony, and that is Texas Central Railway. Up there with the likes of Brightline's Miami to Orlando to hopefully Tampa route, the Northeast Corridor that I'll talk about later, and the aforementioned San Fran to LA route that California High-Speed Rail is looking to bridge. Another of the most talked about routes to implement high-speed rail is Houston to the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, as at a distance between destinations of 250 miles, these metro pairs are frankly perfect, along with all the other cities in the Texas Triangle that have been looked at for high-speed rail considerations in the past and present, including by the federal government with their high-speed rail corridors. Maybe a subject for another time, even if it's connected to these projects loosely. Needless to say, this idea has been around for a long time, even one iteration with state backing being considered in a similar vein as California High-Speed Rail, but was defeated when Southwest Airlines complained to the Texas government that it would hurt traffic on their Houston to DFW shuttle service, because of course it would. Today, this iteration of the project is, like Brightline, spearheaded by a private company, originally founded in 2009 as Lone Star High-Speed Rail LLC, becoming known as Texas Central Partners LLC, going under the trading name of Texas Central Railway in 2012. From the very beginning, Texas Central planned to partner with the Central Japan Railway Company, or JR Central, for this project, the operators of Japan's and the world's first high-speed rail line, the aforementioned Tokaido Shinkansen between Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka. And they always showed their concept art using a version of the famous N700 series bullet trains used on that route. But the project very quickly had to contend with one of the same problems that California High-Speed Rail faced: NIMBYs. In this case, the NIMBYism came from local governments and particularly farming communities along the route between the major urban centers. And if you thought California High-Speed Rail had issues with this little stumbling block, particularly with how vehement California NIMBYs typically are with everything good in this world really, Texas NIMBYs were definitely the Padawans that learned very well from their masters from the West, and they were very close to suing the project to death. The particular issue that was brought up more than anything else was if Texas Central had eminent domain rights to acquire land for the proposed route, and this went back and forth in litigation for years. With an initial proposed start of construction in 2019, that got pushed back to 2021, with even a contractor selected to build the project, and then nothing. Needless to say, that proposed opening date of 2026 is not happening, since they haven't gotten anywhere close to starting construction yet. So much so that their longtime CEO stepped down after having been involved almost from the beginning. At the very least though, in June 2022, the Texas Supreme Court did rule that Texas Central had eminent domain rights, but the case had been brought up so many times beforehand that Texas Central was possibly further behind than ever on its goals, and many questioned if the project was truly dead. But then, an unlikely savior arrived: Amtrak. All aboard, all aboard, all aboard Amtrak! In 2023, Amtrak, and in particular their newly minted Vice President of High-Speed Rail, and probably unironically everybody's favorite transport executive, Andy Byford, considered by some to be one of the greatest transit leaders of this generation, began working to get Texas Central back to an even keel by having Amtrak submit federal grant applications on Texas Central's behalf, which has resulted in the project receiving a study grant from the recent Corridor ID dole for the specific purpose of high-speed rail, while at the same time continuing an idea from 2020 to have Texas Central work with Amtrak on through ticketing between their services. On top of that, Byford and Co. have been drumming up interest and support for this project once more, which could see it also work in collaboration with another project that I'll mention soon, the Dallas-Fort Worth High-Speed Transportation Study. It seems that this could be the spark that starts a fire under Texas Central to build this route once more, and there's no doubt that this could be a hit. It's estimated that over 100,000 people a day do a super commute between DFW and Houston every day, and if the train can be built, there is no doubt that it can be a dominant player in that market, with the journey estimated to take an hour and a half at a top speed of 205 miles an hour, with thus far only one intermediate stop being planned, that being at Brazos Valley near College Station, for the line to serve another big rider generator, students, staff, and guests, read football fans, for the biggest college in the state, Texas A&M. which, if it means we get to see a Shinkansen in the color of the Aggies, that might be pretty cool. If only my alma mater, Penn State, could have something similar. Well, to be fair, we have a locomotive in our colors, and I'm starting to realize I'm going off topic here. Anyways, there's definitely a lot of potential to be had in the Lone Star State, and right now, it's still a renewed effort to get the line up and running. And the recent interest from Amtrak, as well as both the federal government and the Japanese government, who see it as a prime opportunity for both countries, even if thus far not much has come of the grant programs just yet, similar to the ones that California High-Speed Rail and Brightline West received a few months ago. A lot of the pieces are there, they just need to put it together, both literally and metaphorically, for this to happen. And it can bring Texas from being a transit desert of a state as intercity rail goes, to being an envy of the nation, which, knowing the typical Texan attitude, could be a selling point for the public and politicians to begin with. I'm definitely going to keep a close eye on this one, since this can show that even states that historically have been hostile to rail can be won over, particularly if their projected $16 billion, or around $64 million per mile, give or take, is anything to go on. Not quite as good as Brightline, since they have to acquire their own right-of-way, whereas Brightline West doesn't have to worry about that, but it's still pretty good compared to the feared price points going into the 12 figures. Here's hoping for you down there, Texas. Hopefully this doesn't let you down like the Cowboys do to you every year. Sincerely, your friendly neighborhood Eagles fan. From here until the last route we talk about, all the upcoming projects are nowhere near as far in their development as any of the aforementioned ones. But I'm saving the one that we already have for last, since I have something special in relation to it. But before we do, I want to mention something briefly about Brightline's current operation in Florida, since while it's not high-speed rail by the definitions we're using in either area, since I'll reiterate, it's 125 miles per hour on the dedicated line, 30 miles an hour short of the Category 1 standard, and 80 to 110 miles per hour on the rest of the route, which is legacy lines, which at best is 15 miles per hour shy of the Category 2 standard. There is one thing I want to talk about, which is the proposed extension of their line from Orlando to Tampa. From Brightline's inception in 2014, back when it was still called All Aboard Florida, this route was always one they had on their list, and it was even considered to be the first leg of Florida's California high-speed rail-esque attempt at a state-backed high-speed rail system that died for reasons best described in this Alan Fisher video here. A side effect of that initial project is that Interstate 4, the infamous highway between the two cities, was rebuilt with a median wide enough for high-speed trains to run in, and it's confirmed by the state government to be reserved for a high-speed rail line, basically doing the work for Brightline with regard to the right-of-way in a lot of regards. Obviously, a lot more needs to be considered, not least of which is financing, especially with Florida's government, in typical fashion, making it clear that they don't intend to provide funding to the prospective project. But Brightline are still projecting confidence that this will be done sometime later this decade, and some sources seem to suggest that Brightline is looking to run trains at 150 miles an hour on this section. Being a dedicated line, that would still not see it meet Category 1 standards, but there's very little evidence that Brightline is looking to go that fast, and instead would see the line run at 125. Particularly since the trains they use, made up of streamlined Siemens Charger locomotives and venture coaches, can only run 125 anyway, with 130 being done on a test run once. It's going to be curious though, with so much of their energies directed towards Brightline West, if this project will truly begin as soon as we hope, but it's definitely something to hope for with the burgeoning rail services of Florida. But for this upcoming lightning round of sorts, we'll be looking at the various projects that are being seriously considered but not quite at the point of starting planning or construction. Starting off back in Texas with the aforementioned possible complement to Texas Central, Dallas-Fort Worth high-speed transportation. This is actually a pretty short project for a high-speed transport link between, well, Dallas and Fort Worth, Texas. Now, this city pair already has a commuter rail service directly servicing them in the form of Trinity Railway Express, which is certainly a standard commuter rail service as these sorts of things go. Diesel locomotives, bi-level coaches, you know them when you see them. Alongside them though, there's two hybrid rail lines and a third on the way, with Tex Rail and the A train already in service and the Silver Line beginning service in the near future. No, not that one. Not that one either. Oh god, no, not that one. Thank you. But despite the short distances, linking the two major cities of the DFW Metroplex via some form of high-speed transportation along the corridor made by Interstate 30 has been considered by the North Central Texas Council of Governments since spring of 2020. Note how I initially said it was high-speed transportation. Well, that's because for a while, several things have been up for consideration for building this line, including maglev and Hyperloop. Well, it's safe to say, given the complete collapse of the Hyperloop industry over the last several years, to the point that every single company that has been remotely serious about developing Hyperloop has gone bust, because even they and their investors realize what anyone who knows about this stuff knew, that the whole idea was dumb and was never going to work, it's safe to say that the tic-tac in a vacuum tube is firmly off the table for this project. While the project is very much in the planning stages and the alignment is being discussed as of the date of making this video, the general idea is having 3 stations in Fort Worth, Dallas, and, as a massive shock, Arlington. That's right, Arlington, Texas, aka the largest city in the country with no public transit at all. In fact, the city got rid of their only bus route and replaced it with dial-a-ride rideshare services, which is more expensive for the city and worse from a ridership standpoint. To get that city to agree to anything regarding mass transport sounds amazing to me, and it seems like it would involve an underground station both there and at Fort Worth Central Station, and an 80-foot tall elevated line leading to an elevated station at the Hutchinson Convention Center, which, because it's elevated, has already drawn out some of the NIMBYs. I wonder where they were when all those elevated freeways were built. Anyways, while this is very much in the preliminary planning phases, this could be a very exciting project for 2 reasons. For one, it could be an interesting opportunity for Texas Central to expand its potential reach and build up its partnerships, and possibly give it a unique initial operating segment that could be built rather quickly. Whether Texas Central has opened talks with them is not yet known to my knowledge, but they should definitely do it, since the Council of Governments who's backing the project also has visions for a route down to Austin and San Antonio as a possible extension. That's already an idea for most cities of the Texas Triangle neatly linked by high-speed rail lines if all this pans out. Of course, no time frame has been announced, but this is truly a golden opportunity in the making for a state that has long been apprehensive to rail, but could become the envy of the nation, perhaps to the chagrin of other states. In any case, definitely watch this space intently for sure. Secondly, we head all the way up to the Pacific Northwest, where we find the Cascadia Ultra High-Speed Rail Project, a concept for a line between Eugene and Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Washington, and Vancouver, British Columbia, basically in parallel in the broad strokes to the current Amtrak Cascades corridor, but with a vision for line speeds of 250 miles per hour, which would likely make it the fastest service of any train in the world if it's possible. But therein lies a question I have. Is it possible? Well, while the concept for a high-speed rail corridor for this region has existed since the 90s, the current iteration of it was initially championed by the government of Washington State in 2017, with a lot of political coalition creating for such a project between Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia, leading to a memorandum of understanding about the project in 2021, and some refinements of the idea up to 2023, when another high-speed rail study grant was provided from the feds for the Cascadia project. It's certainly a fascinating idea, but the problem is there's simply not much more that's known for certain about what it would entail, aside from the proposed top speed, which, while physically attainable, I wonder if they'll truly stick with it and they'll look for a more standard 200 or 220 miles an hour for the route. Keep an eye on it, and hopefully it won't stay stuck in bureaucracy hell. And for a region of the country that would likely be as eager as they come for high-speed rail, even if it's not quite as population dense as some, this should be a fascinating one. I'm keeping an eye on this intently, and if anyone knows more, definitely let me know. Also, alongside a slew of other corridors that are labeling themselves as high speed, but only by the weak FRA definition of 110 miles an hour, which is worth its own discussion, but I'll leave for another time, there is one state where high-speed rail developments have recently become something interesting indeed, and that is Illinois. And this is for 2 reasons. The first is the ongoing project to upgrade the rail lines and stations in Chicago, known as the Chicago Hub Network. The Chicago Hub is a major infrastructural update to both the legendary Chicago Union Station to allow for through-running operations, as well as upgrades and changes to the rail lines themselves in and around Chicago to allow for a much more frequent and even through-running train services for both Amtrak intercity trains and for Metra, a display of old museum pieces masquerading as Chicago's commuter and regional rail network. Jokes aside, this is shaping up to be one of those projects to me like the Center City Tunnel in my native Philadelphia, where it can be an absolute game changer for rail services in the city and the suburbs to make rail much more attractive, if combined with frequency improvements to make the trains more viable for more trips, which, as discussed in my Corridor ID video, is something that's being considered for a lot of routes that operate out of Chicago, including with Metra. But more directly related to high-speed rail was a development that occurred in May of this year, when a proposal was published by Illinois General Assembly member Mike Quigley for the creation of a proper dedicated high-speed rail line between Chicago and St. Louis, albeit going a different route than the current Amtrak Lincoln service, with 3 general ideas put on the table, each with a goal of a 2.5-hour travel time on the route. The first route would look something similar to the current Lincoln service, but instead of following the Metra Heritage Corridor out of Chicago, it would roughly follow the route of the Metra Rock Island line to Joliet before heading southwest through Gardner, Bloomington, and the state capital of Springfield on its way to East St. Louis, with 2 purpose-built rail lines known as Greenfield lines to serve as feeder routes, connecting Peoria and Champaign to the stop at Bloomington and connecting Decatur to the stop at Springfield. The second route would start in Chicago and circumvent the ex-Rock Island main line around Joliet and run more directly to Kankakee and Champaign with a stop at University Park, which likely means it would follow the Metra Electric District and the ex-Illinois Central line for part of that route, with the stop in Champaign serving the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, before heading west to Decatur and east to Springfield before heading southwest to the proposed end terminus in East St. Louis again on the Illinois side of the river. This run actually takes 2 forms, with one of them using the rights-of-way of Interstates 57, 72, and 55, presumably in the same vein as Brightline West, with another greenfield feeder service connecting Peoria and Bloomington with a stop in Champaign. The third route follows the same general routing as the second one, going to University Park, Kankakee, Champaign, Decatur, and Springfield before reaching East St. Louis. But instead of following the rights-of-ways of freeways like Route 2, this one would be a greenfield line, i.e. building it on its own acquired right-of-way like California High-Speed Rail, Texas Central, or most lines in Europe and Asia, which by far has the best potential from a speed perspective. This proposal is still very much early days and hasn't even been accepted by the legislature, let alone landed on the governor's desk. But given the frankly admirable push that Illinois has been leading the Midwest on with renewing intercity rail services, such as the recent introduction of the Amtrak Borealis service between Chicago, Milwaukee, and the Twin Cities, it's one that I would consider to be the ultimate endgame for truly building a great rail system for the state and the Midwest region. Keeping an eye on this one for sure. This one could be really good to follow. Hi, it's post-production Steve here. Just a quick thing to add on to before anyone yells at me about this. There is another high-speed rail project that's being considered as well, which is a proposed purpose-built line between Atlanta and Charlotte, which I would definitely argue could serve as a southern spine of a possible southeast corridor in the future, and I would definitely love to see that. The big problem here is that we simply don't know much about this project to really deduce what it will be like. Will it be an HSR line by a more recognizable standard, or will it simply be another line meeting the FRA's definition? We simply don't know, which is ironic since this idea has apparently been considered since 2013. This project was given one of the Corridor ID HSR grants back in December, and a Tier 1 environmental impact study was completed in 2021, but the FRA and GDOT, who are the big backers of this project, aren't really giving me much to go on. But I will keep an ear out on this regardless, since this will be another project I think could have the possibility of making another region of the country consider train travel as a viable alternative to the utter hellscapes that is their freeways. Anyway, back to the main video. Alright, and now we get to the very end to talk about what I alluded to before. The only high-speed rail line by either definition running in the country right now. And to the surprise of nobody who lives around where I live, it's Amtrak's Northeast Corridor. Now, the topic of the Northeast Corridor is definitely a convoluted one, and I have plans for an entire video series specifically on this line, its strengths and weaknesses, and what's being done to make it better and what more can be done. But even for all of its numerous faults, it still manages to do what no legacy line in the US is anywhere close to being able to accomplish. Run at not just 125 miles an hour for long portions of its route between Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, Newark, New York, New Haven, Providence, and Boston, but also be able to do at present 150 miles an hour and soon 160 miles an hour in certain sections, meaning that it not only qualifies as high-speed rail by the Category 2 definition, but when the new trains of the Acela service come online, hopefully by the end of this year, it will allow those sections to reach the Category 1 speed definition for purpose-built lines on mostly legacy infrastructure. But the big problem overall if you've ever rode the Northeast Corridor is that you might not notice it that much, since the line is a lot slower than it has any business being in terms of overall trip time. And that's for a lot of reasons, including those that I'm listing on screen here. This is overall a shame really, since not only is more possible from this line due to upgrades of current infrastructure, but more was possible in the past too. In fact, Amtrak services can definitely run faster on the Northeast Corridor right now, but the timetable is pretty heavily padded. In fact, back when the famous, or infamous maybe, Metroliner services ran, it had a 2.5-hour non-stop schedule between DC and New York City. And the closest analog to that today, the Acela services that only stop in Baltimore, Wilmington, Philly, and Newark, take 2 hours and 46 minutes, with a 25-mile-per-hour higher top speed than the Metroliners. The thing is though, the pace of the past could easily be superseded, and even without some of the infrastructure upgrade projects that are underway as of the date of making this video. But one of the biggest reasons boils down to the fact that Amtrak is not the only service that runs on this line, but it shares the track with no less than 6 commuter rail operators, or 8 depending on how you count them, but 6 of them that are actually important. And it even has freight services, though nowhere near as much as there used to be long ago. And aside from the infrastructure itself, which has famous sections of quadruple tracking, particularly between DC and New York City, so that the high-speed Amtrak trains can run on the inside express tracks, and the local commuter trains can use the outer tracks, allowing for greater capacity and flexibility in the case of disruptions, the fact that there is tremendous variation in the service speeds, frequency, and timetabling of different services without coordination leaves every operator worse off, not just Amtrak. As much as some understandably argue that a high-speed rail corridor should only be for high-speed trains, I don't think that's really something you can get away with here in the Northeast megalopolis. And given that running more standard intercity services on high-speed lines is nothing new in places like France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, and the like, it's not improbable to make every service on the corridor run better merely by coordinating schedules and making spot infrastructure improvements, particularly the junctions between the NEC and other lines, which are another lesser talked about kind of delays. But more to the point, even with these annoyances, the NEC is seeing improvements in the form of both infrastructure upgrades and new rolling stock. The infrastructure improvements on the docket are numerous, but 4 in particular stand out above the others. From south to north, there's the Frederick Douglass Tunnel in Baltimore, which replaces the current Baltimore and Potomac tunnels heading south out of Baltimore Penn Station for intercity trains, which is desperately needed as those tunnels date back to the 1870s, no I'm not kidding, and due to the tight corners in them and the severely restricted loading gauge, they have a top speed of 40 miles an hour in them, and also the fact that there's only 2 of them, making them one of the route's worst bottlenecks. Building these new tunnels to allow for trains to run 110 miles an hour will be an instant time saver and improved capacity, particularly when the old tunnels are refurbished after the new ones are complete, as they will serve marked commuter trains when all is said and done. Construction on this project has already started and is expected to be completed by 2035. An incredibly long timeline to be sure, but hopefully that can be expedited in the years to come, particularly since the state of Maryland is heavily invested in the project. Immediately after Baltimore is another main area of infrastructure improvements, namely the introduction of the fourth section of 160 mph running on the route. For context, of the 457 miles of the Northeast Corridor from Washington to Boston, there are only 34 miles of it capable of handling the Acela trains at their top speed, currently at 150 miles an hour with the current Acelas, and 160 miles per hour with the upcoming Acela 2 sets. The first of these being between Hamilton and New Brunswick, New Jersey, the second being between Shannock and East Greenwich, Rhode Island, along with a shorter segment after some S-curves at East Greenwich to Cranston, Rhode Island near Providence, and the third being between East Junction and Mansfield, Massachusetts. However, this idea from what's gathered from the NEC Commission is to add a fourth section of track capable of handling those speeds, and easily the longest one of them all to date, running from just outside Baltimore all the way to just past Newark, Delaware on its way to Wilmington, which, while a long-term idea at the moment, is made clear that it's seriously being considered by one of the most spectacular rebuilds on this section of the line, the rebuilding of 3 bridges along this portion of the route. The Gunpowder River Bridge near Chase, Maryland, the Bush River Bridge near Aberdeen, Maryland, and most famously, the Susquehanna River Bridge between Havre de Grace and Perryville, Maryland, all of which are sitting at around 110 years old, are only double-tracked, and the Susquehanna River Bridge in particular is a big momentum sink, forcing trains down to 90 miles an hour as they cross. The rebuilds for all 3 bridges, which are beginning their pre-construction activities as of the date of making this video, will see the bridges become quad-tracked and have their structures upgraded for speeds of 160 miles an hour from day one, thus future-proofing them for higher speeds on the rest of the segment, along with being able to accommodate higher train frequencies and new services, including a planned extension of the Mark Penn Line service, which runs on the corridor to Newark, Delaware, to meet with SEPTA's Wilmington-Newark line there. Overall, to me, this is one of the most underrated aspects of these upgrade projects. The final 2 big ones under construction now are technically part of the same overarching project, known as the Gateway Project. The first one is the replacement of another infamous bottleneck, the Portal Bridge, which crosses the Hackensack River between Secaucus and Kearney, New Jersey, near New York City. Not only is the bridge nearly 115 years old, double-tracked and limited to 60 miles per hour, but it's made even worse by the fact that it's a swing bridge, meant to move out of the way to allow boats and barges to pass it. This is naturally a massive problem for operations on the NEC, since delays can easily be incurred and snowball across the entire system, both from the bridge opening, but also malfunctions of the bridge failing to reset properly. The former has happened to me before. It annoys me greatly. Therefore, it's relieving to see that this one is the furthest along of the 4 major projects, with a new bridge currently under construction next to the current one. This new bridge, the Portal North Bridge, is a lot taller than the previous one, tall enough for boats and barges to pass underneath it without having to swing or lift out of the way. And while it's only double-tracked, it's still going to be an improvement in efficiency of service, as it will see a speed increase from 60 to 90 miles an hour. Portal North looks to be the first of these major projects to be complete, as recently it was announced to be 50% complete and set to open on time in 2027 and perhaps come in under its $1.7 billion budget, which is a welcome change of pace to be sure. So Portal North, along with the replacement of the nearby Sawtooth bridges in Kearney, look like a very good addition to improve the reliability of services around New York, and even more so when the final of the 4 projects I'll discuss here comes online. And that's the creation, at long last, of 2 additional Hudson River tunnels going from New Jersey into Manhattan into Penn Station. The current 2 tunnels in use date back to the opening of Penn Station in 1910 and have been deteriorating for a while, particularly after Hurricane Sandy struck in 2012. These 2 new tunnels will not only allow for the current tunnels to finally receive the renewal they always needed, but also massively increase capacity and especially reliability and flexibility if something goes wrong. And believe you me, when something goes wrong in the tunnel now, it goes incredibly wrong for everybody involved. I have my own horror story I can regale you at some point, perhaps in my NEC series, or earlier if you ask nicely. But even if the cases when things were going wrong weren't relevant to the issue, the lack of track capacity going under the Hudson has long made this portion of the line a huge bottleneck in its own right, and adding these new tunnels, like the ones in Baltimore, are a major step in the right direction, even if, again, the time frames are absurdly long and will likely need to be sped up in the coming years. And this is to say nothing about the new rolling stock, aka the trains that are coming online in the next few years to replace the aging equipment currently in use on both the prestigious Acela services and the more utilitarian Northeast Regional services. Obviously, the most talked about aspect here are the new Alstom Avelia Liberties, or the Acela 2 sets, which are the next generation high-speed train sets, the first of their kind in the world, capable of 165 miles an hour on current track and 186 with future upgraded lines that were supposed to replace the near 25-year-old Acela 1 sets 3 years ago. However, in the development of these trains, what is revealed has pretty much been all of the problems imaginable, from leaking hydraulics from the tilt mechanisms to electrical issues to the window shattering, and thus has seen their entry to service delayed multiple times and people wondering if they will ever enter service and some questioning whether they should enter service. But this year has actually been presenting a lot of good news regarding these trains finally. Back in January, the biggest hurdle for getting these trains cleared for service, the passing of their computer model testing with the FRA, was complete, and increasing in testing of these sets has come thick and fast from April onwards in particular. And I myself have gone to Princeton Junction at night fairly regularly, and every time I have, there's been an Acela 2 running up and down the Jersey racetrack on test runs, a lot of which you've seen in this video already. Alongside that, several sets have been sent from their main storage yard in Philadelphia to Ivy City Yard in Washington, D.C., Sunnyside Yard in New York, and Southampton Street Yard in Boston for crew orientations. The current target date for seeing these trains into service is the fall of this year, and given that that date has not seen an alteration in months, it seems to me like things might finally be on the right track at long last, which is good because my god I want to ride these things. I enjoyed the original Acelas, and I want to see this as a worthy successor, which I know it's capable of. But that's not the only equipment order that's on the way for the Northeast Corridor, or indeed the entire Amtrak network nationwide. And this one so far has been a bit smoother than the Avelia Liberties. For pretty much every service on the Northeast Corridor that's not the Acela, but more relevant here for the 125-mile-an-hour capable Northeast Regional services, Amtrak uses a tried-and-true configuration of locomotive hauled stock powered by relatively new, as in 10-year-old, Siemens ACS-64 City Sprinter electric locomotives, hauling the near 50-year-old Amfleet passenger cars based heavily on the 1960s Budd Metroliner design. True to the image that people have of equipment built by Budd, the Amfleets are robust and reliable, and have been fairly well suited to the services they run on here. But the age is starting to catch up to them, alongside the disadvantages going forward of running standard locomotive hauled sets. This is why in 2021, Amtrak put in a massive equipment order with Siemens for a bulk order of brand new train sets known as the Aero sets, which are essentially an Americanized version of the iconic railjet sets built by Siemens for ÖBB, the Austrian Federal Railways, generally considered to be the best non-high-speed trains in Europe. These sets will be run as push-pull trains with a locomotive at one end and a cab control car on the other, allowing the train to be driven from either end, making for faster turnaround times at terminal stations and being one part of the puzzle to increasing frequencies of service, which is actually something Amtrak is doing now by running some of the Northeast Regional trains with one ACS-64 locomotive on each end of the train, known as a top and tailing configuration. Speaking of the ACS-64s, these admittedly very good locomotives will not be the ones used to haul the Aero sets, as these sets will be run by, perhaps crazy enough, a unique dual-mode version of the Siemens Charger family, which is a family of diesel locomotives at present. However, this variant, called the ALC42E, can also be powered from the overhead wires when the line has them, and run on a diesel engine for routes that run beyond it, like select Northeast Regionals, the Pennsylvanian, and the Carolinian, among others. Regardless, these sets will still perform better under wire in any case, able to reach a service top speed of 125 miles an hour under electric power and 110 miles an hour under diesel power. But in any case, these sets will offer a lot of flexibility from the services they run on, since this means that the time-consuming engine swaps, seen most notably at Washington Union Station and New Haven Union Station, will no longer have to happen, thus speeding up journey times and reduce maintenance issues. Sadly, this means for Amtrak that most of the 70 ACS-64s on Amtrak's roster will be rendered surplus, with a select number of them staying on the roster to work long-distance trains on the corridor, like the Crescent, Silver Meteor, Silver Star, and Cardinal, and the remainder will be sent elsewhere. Though I can certainly see most of these units sent to commuter rail operators along the corridor where they'd be a big benefit, particularly with the likes of MARC in Maryland and the MBTA in Massachusetts to jumpstart electrified services that they want to do and really should have done a long time ago. As for the Aero sets, the first demonstration coach was revealed late last year at the Siemens factory in California. Delivery of the first sets is expected in the Pacific Northwest on the Cascades corridor in 2026, and their first appearance in the Northeast is expected in 2027 or 2028. Now, I've heard a lot of concerns regarding the choice of these trains as the replacement of the Amfleet cars for one particular reason: the seats. The Amfleet seats are legendary as being some of the most comfortable things you can ride in on the rails, and tricking people from Europe to think that they stumbled into the first class section when they had a coach class ticket. Actual story I once heard, by the way. Some even go so far as to say that the coach class seats on the Amfleets are as good, if not better, than the premium class seats on Brightline at present. And with the introduction of Siemens Venture coaches and their, shall we say, controversial seating design on services like the San Joaquins in California and the Amtrak Midwest services, a lot of people fear with these new trains that the comfort level of the new seats would take a nosedive compared to the Amfleets. However, I have reason to believe these fears are unfounded for two reasons. The first is the big one. The seat choice on the current Amtrak Venture coaches was not Amtrak's idea, nor was it Siemens' idea. It was the choice of both IDOT, the Illinois Department of Transportation, and Caltrans, the California Department of Transportation, for whom the current cars in use are made as a bespoke joint order for. Amtrak just runs them and not much else. And this is further accentuated by the second reason I have for being confident. Amtrak's interior renders already shown for the Aero sets show seating configurations that look nothing like the current seats, and they look more akin to the seats on Via Rail Canada's Venture sets, which are being lauded for their seating, as well as the general improvements they brought in every other regard. This says to me that when Amtrak themselves are the main people to deal with, expect your seats to be a lot better than most. Time will tell, of course, but I highly suspect, looking at the evidence on the table, that your trains will still be as comfortable as ever, all the while having a more airy and open feeling as opposed to the airplane-esque interior of the current Amfleets and all the shortcomings of such. On the whole, the trains on the corridor are shaping up to be something radically different than what had come before on this line, and we can see the first steps in that transition later this year, provided the Acela 2s are sorted out as smoothly as I think is looking. I hope. But even then, there are some visions that go well beyond what's on the table today, including from the Northeast Corridor Commission, who oversees the NEC's various operators and infrastructure projects. Though there are a lot of question marks as to what would be done in such a scenario where the NEC is rebuilt as a true high-speed rail line in the more modern sense, from upgrades to the existing lines to building a brand new parallel high-speed rail line. There's not much consensus as to what the idea would be, and nowhere is that more evident than the portion of the line north of New York City. Generally speaking, with some obvious bottlenecks and momentum sinks that I mentioned, among a few other things, the southern half of the NEC from DC to New York is generally not too bad, and has been considered by many to be more easy to upgrade to true high-speed standards for the majority of its route than most rail lines that people can imagine. The real problem child, though, is north of New York City. Most notably, the section between New York City and New Haven, Connecticut, particularly since that section is not owned by Amtrak. It's owned by the MTA's Metro North Railroad, who notoriously have been horrible with line speeds, even when taking the winding nature of that section of the line into account, alongside being horrible with track upgrades and infrastructure maintenance, which I'll definitely rant about another time. Long story short, it's clear that people are getting fed up with the uselessness of Metro North and making this line come anywhere close to its potential, and they being a key reason why the journey between New York City and Boston is an hour longer on average than the journey between New York City and DC at present, despite the distance being similar. Various proposals have been put forward, but by far the most radical proposal is a group known simply as North Atlantic Rail, backed by a group of politicians and businessmen from Long Island, which is made obvious given the direction they have in mind for the route, which is for the high-speed rail line to be built out onto Long Island, follow the route of the Long Island Railroad's main line out to Ronkonkoma, before heading north, going under Long Island Sound in a tunnel to New Haven, and then follow the Hartford line to the north as far as Hartford, before running in its own dedicated right-of-way through northern Connecticut to Providence, Rhode Island, where it rejoins the current NEC alignment to Boston. A radical idea to be sure, but one that has become rather popular in some areas, even if there are several alignments that are also being considered for said route, and that generally there's a lot of question marks that have yet to be answered about this idea. It is a radical departure, but it does illustrate how much of a desire there is to make the NEC live up to its sky-high potential at long last. It's currently the best rail line in the country, but it has so much low-hanging fruit to make it truly amazing that you forgive the metaphorical tree of looking like it will fall over and spill said low-hanging fruit. Overall though, this is the topic I want to go into in future videos, but suffice it to say that the only true high-speed rail line in the country by any metric is one that can be made far better, and the powers that be know it. There's good stuff already being built, and there's a lot more that can be done, and I want to dedicate an overarching mega project towards it. More than anything else, definitely watch this space. And now, to finally bring things to a conclusion, high-speed rail in America is no longer a fantasy. It's a thing that's legitimately happening, and I stand by the notion that this will be one of the most pivotal moments in the history of American transportation. In the case of projects like Brightline West, I see it as potentially having a similar effect to what America's very first superhighway, the Pennsylvania Turnpike, did in the 1940s, as it was built as one of the first limited access highways in America, running between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and being one of the key inspirations of Dwight Eisenhower in the creation of the Interstate Highway System, and even becoming a part of that system. Thus its official designation now is Interstate 76. Connecting two major metro areas in a way that has never before been seen on this continent often makes a lot of people wake up and break their cynicism over such a radical idea, and leads to cultural demands for more of it in more places. And adding to the Pennsylvania Turnpike analogy, the PA Turnpike was built on a right-of-way of a proposed railroad line, and with the first dedicated high-speed rail line in the country being mostly built in the median of a freeway, there's a kind of beautiful symmetry to it that I really like. And that's alongside the fact that building a high-speed rail line in an interstate right-of-way seems to make the concept much more approachable, while relevant agencies are established and bolstered that could build more efficiently beyond these constraints. And for a project like California High-Speed Rail, the successful launch of a service like Brightline West may well be what the doctor ordered for government officials to get their butts in gear and actually take this sort of project seriously, and put the money that's wasted in other forms of transport that don't need it, and put it in a place that will actually return their investment much better, as well as provide actual societal benefit. High-speed rail is not merely something that would be nice to have. As our economy, our society, and our environments change, it will be found that high-speed rail, as well as improvements or even a fundamental rethink of our general passenger and freight rail systems, will be one of the keys to future-proofing the nation's economy and society. And the fact of the matter is, people want this to happen too. On a broader level, over 70% of Americans want to see better public transportation solutions, including high-speed rail. And on a personal level, everyone I talk to loves the idea of high-speed rail and are disappointed that we don't have it in so many places, even if the technology has been around for 60 years at this point. And while we do technically have one high-speed rail line in service, it's definitely not by any means a world beater. But as mentioned, at least that one does have legitimate potential to be a great system in its own right by world standards, if we invest in it. And that's the biggest thing. It's not about the technical considerations, it's not about the distances, and it's definitely not about public demand for it. It's about the will to do it. And that's something that politicians and people need to hear. As such, I encourage you, wherever you may be, to push the issue of passenger rail and even high-speed rail with your representatives in government, and tell them that not only do you want these to happen, but your state and the country needs this to happen. And if you want to arm yourself with more info on the matter, I'll provide links to some really good websites in the description below to help the case, including from the largest activist group pushing for this sort of revolution, the High Speed Rail Alliance. The world at large has benefited immensely from high-speed rail, and it's great to see it coming to the US. But to achieve what can be possible, we need to get ready now. And in regards to the Northeast, that's what I'll be focusing on, but you can do so in your home states too. Particularly as you imagine for a second, a world where there's a viable alternative to the annoyances and impracticality of air travel and the traffic nightmares of the automobile between major cities and towns. A mode of transport that was environmentally sustainable, more comfortable, more convenient for more people, and is actually able to help make places around you more like places that are made for people rather than just the cars they drive. Now, there's a very valid question that I want to talk about in the future too, about how much our network really ought to consist of dedicated high-speed lines, and how much our network should be made up of legacy lines upgraded to handle both freight and faster passenger trains, with a sort of spectrum I've considered, with the far extreme being China, which is focused on nothing but high-speed rail lines to the detriment of its slower passenger and freight rail services, and another extreme being places like Germany, where their high-speed rail lines are mostly upgraded legacy lines, and they put more of an emphasis on their regional and freight networks than most countries in Europe do. This is a much broader topic to be sure, but the point still remains. Even those countries see the benefit of having high-speed rail corridors set up between major centers. And America tacitly sees this, but doesn't go anywhere near far enough in most cases. All it takes in many cases is one line to be built to true Category 1 standards to see what it can do. For Japan, it was the Tokaido Shinkansen. For France, it was the LGV Sud-Est. For Germany, it was the Hanover-Würzburg high-speed railway. For Spain, it was the Madrid to Seville Ave line. For Italy, it was the Rome to Florence Direttissima line. And for China, it was the Beijing to Tianjin line. It takes one spark to ignite a fire, and the metaphorical match is about to be lit for the US of A. It's looking promising, but we need more to be done for certain, so that one day in the future, when Brightline West, California High-Speed Rail, Texas Central, or a high-speed NEC become part of the transport scene, they will be at the vanguard of a true revolution, one long desired by the people and one long missed for all of America and how we get around.